Your Honor, Mrs. Vance is clearly blowing this whole thing out of proportion. That fence was already falling apart, and now she's acting like I destroyed some...
I stepped into my courtroom that morning, the gavel already itching in my hand, and I knew right away this case was going to test my patience. The docket read, Vance 5 Sterling. The plaintiff, Mrs. Evelyn Vance, a 74-year-old widow. The defendant, Julian Sterling, 25 years old, and the son of a very prominent, very loud sitting state senator. Oh, the headline practically wrote itself. Senator's son disrespects elderly widow in court. I've seen my fair share of silver spoon-fed brats walking through these double doors, but the aura of pure, unfiltered entitlement radiating off this kid was in a league of its own. I took my seat, adjusted my robe, and peered down over my glasses at the two parties. On my left stood Mrs. Vance. She was tiny, frail, wrapped in a worn but meticulously ironed cardigan. Her silver hair was pinned back neatly, and she held her hands clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white, clutching a manila folder of evidence like it was a shield. She looked completely overwhelmed by the cameras and the legal environment, but there was a quiet, undeniable dignity about her. On my right was Mr. Julian Sterling. He wore a tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than Mrs. Vance's entire car, a gaudy gold watch, and a posture that screamed, "Daddy will fix this before lunch." He was actively tapping away on his smartphone, a bored smirk plastered across his face, not even bothering to look up when the bailiff announced my entrance. In the gallery right behind him sat one of his father's handlers, a slick-looking man in a gray pinstripe suit, watching the room with hawk eyes. "All right, let's get this circus under control," I barked, my voice cutting through the low murmur of the room like a physical blow. "Phones away. Now, in my courtroom, you respect the process, or I will have the bailiff escort you to a holding cell where the cell reception is significantly less accommodating." Julian let out a theatrical sigh, slowly sliding the phone into his breast pocket. He offered me a condescending practice smile. "My apologies, Your Honor. Just handling some pressing campaign matters for my father." "The only pressing matter you have today is standing right in front of me," I snapped back, narrowing my eyes. "Mrs. Vance, you are suing Mr. Sterling for $8,500 in property damage. You claim he drove his sports car through your front fence, destroying your property and a memorial garden dedicated to your late husband. Mr. Sterling, you are denying responsibility, claiming the fence was already a structural hazard. I don't have time for political spin or fairy tales. Let's hear the absolute truth." "Mrs. Vance, you have the floor," I said, softening my tone just a fraction. "I've dealt with bullies my entire career, and the fastest way to disarm them is to give their victims an uninterrupted voice. Tell me exactly what happened on the night of October 14th. Mrs. Vance cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly before finding its footing. "Your Honor, it was around midnight. I was asleep. Suddenly there was a terrible crash, like an explosion right outside my bedroom window. I was terrified. I grabbed my robe and went out to the front porch. A bright red sports car had plowed completely through my white picket fence and stopped right in the middle of my late husband's rose garden." She paused, swallowing hard, fighting back tears. "He planted those roses for our 40th anniversary. I watched her closely. Real pain. You cannot fake that kind of heartache. And who was driving the car, ma'am?" She pointed a shaky finger directly at the defendant. "He was Mr. Sterling. He stumbled out of the driver's side. He wasn't hurt, but he was furious. Not at himself, Your Honor, but at my house." Julian let out a loud, obnoxious scoff, shifting his weight from one expensive loafer to the other. "Oh, come on, that's a total exaggeration. I merely pointed out that the street lighting was completely substandard." I slammed my hand down flat on the desk. The sound echoed through the high-ceilinged room like a gunshot. "Did I say it was your turn to speak?" "No, I did not. You keep your mouth shut until I address you directly. Do you understand me, Mr. Sterling?" Julian's jaw tightened, his face flushing a dull, angry red. The political handler in the gallery shifted nervously in his seat. "Yes, Your Honor," Julian muttered. "Speak up. Yes, Your Honor, like you actually mean it." "Yes, Your Honor." "Good. Keep it that way." I turned back to the plaintiff. "Continue, Mrs. Vance. What did he say to you?" "He told me to relax," she said, her eyes welling up again. "He reached into his jacket, pulled out a wad of $100 bills, threw a few on the grass, and said, 'Buy yourself some new dirt, Grandma. This property is an eyesore anyway.' Then he made a phone call, and a black SUV picked him up 10 minutes later. He just left his car wrecked in my yard." The courtroom went dead silent. Throwing money at an elderly widow standing in her ruined memorial garden? It was the textbook definition of callous arrogance. I slowly turned my gaze back to Julian Sterling, feeling that familiar, cold focus lock into place. He was about to find out that all of his daddy's political connections couldn't buy his way out of my courtroom. I turned my absolute coldest glare onto the defendant. All right, Mr. Sterling, let's hear your version of this fairy tale. And remember, you are under oath in a court of law. Daddy's PR team isn't here to spin it for you, and I am not your voting demographic. Julian adjusted his expensive silk tie, trying to regain that arrogant composure. He put on a slick, practiced politician-in-training voice. Your Honor, as I stated in my written response, the fence was practically rotting away. It was a pre-existing safety hazard. I was simply driving home when I had to swerve sharply to avoid a stray dog that ran into the street. If her property had been properly maintained to city code, my vehicle wouldn't have sustained nearly as much damage. Frankly, considering the repair bill for my car, I should be the one countersuing. I just stared at him. I let the dead silence hang in the courtroom for a full 10 seconds. Sometimes, letting a fool's ridiculous words echo in the air is the best way to expose them. Countersuing? I finally said, my voice dropping dangerously low. You drove a 4,000-pound sports car into a residential yard at midnight, destroyed a widow's memorial garden, fled the scene before the police arrived, and you genuinely think you are the victim here? It was an unavoidable accident, he insisted, though his confident facade was beginning to crack. And I did leave compensation. $200 is more than enough for some dirt and a few old planks of wood. Oh, you are a real piece of work, I muttered, shaking my head in disgust. I flipped open the manila folder on my desk. Let's look at the police report, shall we? Because unlike you, the police deal in facts. The officers arrived on the scene after you conveniently escaped in your little getaway car. They noted the skid marks. No evidence of swerving, no evidence of a stray dog. What they did find was your abandoned vehicle, registered to your father's political action committee, and an empty bottle of imported vodka on the passenger floorboard. Julian's face went completely pale. In the gallery, the slick political handler suddenly sat bolt upright, furiously typing something on his phone. The report also says, I continued, tapping the paper with my pen, that you called the precinct the next morning to report the car stolen. A claim the police quickly dismissed when they pulled the street intersection camera footage, showing you clearly behind the wheel minutes before the crash. So, not only did you destroy her property, you filed a false police report to cover your tracks. That report is entirely biased, Julian stammered, panic finally setting in. My father is already looking into the officers involved in that filing. I turned my absolute coldest glare onto the defendant. All right, Mr. Sterling, let's hear your version of this fairy tale. And remember, you are under oath in a court of law. Daddy's PR team isn't here to spin it for you, and I am not your voting demographic. Julian adjusted his expensive silk tie, trying to regain that arrogant composure. He put on a slick, practiced, politician-in-training voice. Your Honor, as I stated in my written response, the fence was a pre-existing safety hazard. I was simply driving home when I had to swerve sharply to avoid a stray dog that ran into the street. If her property had been properly maintained to city code, my vehicle wouldn't have sustained nearly as much damage. Frankly, considering the repair bill for my car, I should be the one countersuing. I just stared at him. I let the dead silence hang in the courtroom for a full 10 seconds. Sometimes, letting a fool's ridiculous words echo in the air is the best way to expose them. Countersuing? I finally said, my voice dropping dangerously low. You drove a 4,000-pound sports car into a residential yard at midnight, destroyed a widow's memorial garden, fled the scene before the police arrived, and you genuinely think you are the victim here? It was an unavoidable accident, he insisted, though his confident facade was beginning to crack. And I did leave compensation. $200 is more than enough for some dirt and a few old planks of wood. Oh, you are a real piece of work, I muttered, shaking my head in disgust. I flipped open the manila folder on my desk. Let's look at the police report, shall we? Because unlike you, the police deal in facts. The officers arrived on the scene after you conveniently escaped in your little getaway car. They noted the skid marks. No evidence of swerving. No evidence of a stray dog. What they did find was your abandoned vehicle, registered to your father's political action committee, and an empty bottle of imported vodka on the passenger floorboard. Julian's face went completely pale. In the gallery, the slick political handler suddenly sat bolt upright, furiously typing something on his phone. The report also says, I continued, tapping the paper with my pen, that you called the precinct the next morning to report the car stolen. A claim the police quickly dismissed when they pulled the street intersection camera footage showing you clearly behind the wheel minutes before the crash. So, not only did you destroy her property, you filed a false police report to cover your tracks. That report is entirely biased, Julian stammered, panic finally setting in. My father is already looking into the officers involved in that filing. I slammed the gavel down so hard the sound cracked like thunder, silencing the entire room instantly. Looking into the officers? I repeated, my voice rising to a volume that made my bailiff stand at full attention. Are you standing in my courtroom under oath and threatening the careers of police officers because they had the audacity to do their jobs? Is that what you're telling me, Mr. Sterling? Julian took a physical step back, raising his hands defensively. I didn't say threaten, Your Honor. I just meant. I know exactly what you meant, I roared. You think because your father's name is on a ballot, the law is just a minor inconvenience for you. You think you can drive intoxicated, destroy a widow's property, throw chump change at her like she's a beggar, file a false police report, and then intimidate the officers who caught you in your pathetic lie. You are not a victim, sir. You are a public menace. At that exact moment, the slick political handler in the gallery jumped to his feet, unable to contain himself. Your Honor, with all due respect, my client's father would prefer we handle this matter privately and settle. Sit down and shut your mouth, I yelled, pointing my gavel straight at him. I don't care if his father is the President of the United States. This is my courtroom. You are a spectator. If you utter one more syllable, my bailiff will physically drag you out into the street. Do you understand me? The handler's mouth snapped shut. He slowly sank back into his seat, his face a mask of humiliated shock. I turned my fury back to Julian, who was now sweating profusely. The designer suit suddenly looked a little too tight on him. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by the trembling reality of a spoiled boy who had finally hit a brick wall his daddy couldn't tear down. Now, I said, taking a deep, sharp breath to steady my tone, turning my attention back to the plaintiff. Mrs. Vance, I have your estimates here for the fence and the landscaping, $8,500. Tell me about the rose garden. Why is it so expensive to replace? Mrs. Vance wiped a tear from her wrinkled cheek. Your Honor, those weren't just any bushes. My late husband Thomas imported the seeds from England. We tended to them every day for 20 years. When he passed away from cancer 5 years ago, that garden was the only place I still felt close to him. Mr. Sterling didn't just break a fence. He tore up the soil, destroyed the roots, and crushed the stone memorial plaque. The landscaper said the soil needs complete environmental treatment because of the leaking car fluids, and the heritage roses have to be specially sourced. I looked down at the photographs submitted into evidence. The destruction was total. Deep, violent tire ruts, crushed trellises, and motor oil soaking into the earth where a beautiful sanctuary used to be. And this arrogant punk thought $200 and an insult covered it. I slammed the folder onto my desk, the sharp smack echoing through the high-ceilinged room. My eyes locked onto the young man trembling before me. Julian Sterling's initial arrogance had completely shattered, replaced by the wide-eyed panic of a spoiled child who had finally hit a brick wall his father's money couldn't dismantle. $200, I repeated, my voice cold and sharp as a scalpel. You throw $200 at a grieving widow in the dark of night, standing in the wreckage of a memorial you just obliterated, and you call that adequate compensation? You think your pocket change buys 20 years of memories? You think it buys the love and devotion Mrs. Vance poured into that garden for her late husband? Julian swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Your Honor, I didn't mean any disrespect. I was in a panic. My father, Senator Sterling, always taught me to handle problems swiftly and do not bring your father into this. I snapped, cutting him off so fast he flinched. Your father was not the one sitting behind the wheel with an empty bottle of vodka. Your father was not the coward who fled the scene. And your father is certainly not the one standing in my courtroom answering to the law. You are 25 years old, sir. At your age, real adults take responsibility for their actions. What are you doing? You are using the title of senator's son as a get-out-of-jail-free card to trample over innocent people. The courtroom was dead silent. Not a cough, not a whisper. Every eye was glued to the bench. The slick campaign handler in the gallery was now slumped in his seat, his face ashen, too terrified to move a muscle. "You think you are special, Mr. Sterling?" I leaned forward, looking right through his expensive designer shell. "Let me give you a harsh reality check. In this room, you are not a golden boy. You are not a VIP. You are a defendant. A defendant who made a reckless mistake, lied under oath, and had the unmitigated gall to blame his victim for the damage." To my left, Mrs. Vance quietly pulled a tissue from her purse and dabbed at the tears rolling down her cheeks. She didn't speak, but the profound relief washing over her face was the only proof I needed. For the first time, the bully who had steamrolled her was being stripped bare in the harsh light of truth. "You claim her fence was rotting, that she failed to maintain her property," I continued, tapping the police damage assessment. "The reality is, that fence was solid maple, treated annually. The only reason it collapsed is because a 2-ton vehicle barreled into it at 60 miles an hour in a residential zone. Your recklessness wasn't just property damage. It was a callous disregard for human life." Julian opened his mouth to speak, then snapped it shut. Even he realized that any excuse he offered now would only dig his grave deeper. "You want to handle this swiftly?" I smirked, a smile utterly devoid of warmth. "Fine. I am exceptionally good at swift resolutions. But trust me, you are not going to like how I handle it." "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice eerily calm now, the kind of calm that comes right before a hurricane makes landfall. "You came into my courtroom today expecting me to bow to your last name. You expected Mrs. Vance to cower because you wear an expensive suit and your father shakes hands with the governor. But the law doesn't care who your daddy is. The law only sees the facts. And the facts show a reckless, entitled brat who thinks the world is his personal ashtray. Well, not in my courtroom." Julian was completely silent, his eyes darting desperately toward his handler in the gallery. But the slick man in the pinstripe suit was actively staring at his own shoes, entirely detaching himself from the sinking ship. Loyalty in politics only lasts as long as the optics are good, and right now, Julian was a walking PR disaster. "I am awarding the plaintiff the full requested amount," I declared, my voice ringing out clearly across the room. $8,500 for the complete restoration of her property, the environmental soil treatment, and the heritage rose garden. Furthermore, you will cover all of her court costs, and I am ordering that payment be made in full before you leave this building, not in 30 days. Not when your father's campaign manager decides to cut a check. Today, Your Honor, I don't have that kind of liquid cash on me," Julian stammered, his voice cracking, the polished veneer entirely stripped away. "My personal accounts are tied to a trust, and my father—" "Figure it out," I snapped, aiming my pen at him like a weapon. "Call your bank, call your trust manager, call your father and tell him you finally made a mess. He can't just sweep under the rug with a press release. But you are not walking out of those double doors until Mrs. Vance has every single penny she is owed." Mrs. Vance let out a shaky breath, a small, profoundly grateful smile touching her lips. But I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. "Now, as for the criminal aspect of your little midnight joyride," I continued, folding my hands together and resting them deliberately on the heavy wood of the bench. "I am a civil judge. I cannot throw you in jail for driving under the influence, nor can I prosecute you for fleeing the scene of an accident or filing a false police report. That is technically outside my jurisdiction." Julian's shoulders dropped just a fraction. A microscopic, almost invisible sigh of relief escaped his lips. He thought he had dodged the real bullet. "However," I said, leaning forward, my eyes narrowing into absolute slits. The relief vanished from his face instantly, replaced by a fresh, suffocating wave of dread. "I am absolutely within my rights to forward the complete, unedited transcript of today's sworn testimony, along with the video footage and the police reports, directly to the district attorney's office. And let me assure you, Mr. Sterling, the DA loves a slam-dunk case. They do not care about your father's upcoming re-election. They care about holding perjurers accountable." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Julian Sterling wasn't just pale anymore. He looked physically ill. The reality of a felony perjury charge, coupled with a DUI and fleeing the scene, had finally pierced through his impenetrable bubble of privilege. He wasn't looking at his phone now. He wasn't smirking. He was staring at me with the wide, terrified eyes of a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming 18-wheeler. "You wouldn't," he whispered, the words barely escaping his dry throat. I leaned back in my leather chair, interlacing my fingers. Try me, Mr. Sterling. I have been on this bench longer than you have been alive. I do not make empty threats. I make promises. And I promise you, if I do not see a verified transfer of funds or a certified check handed to my bailiff in the next 10 minutes, my clerk will hit send on an email to the district attorney that will end your father's political career and begin your criminal one. Suddenly, the slick political handler in the gallery couldn't take it anymore. He vaulted over the low wooden partition, completely ignoring courtroom decorum. Julian, shut up, he hissed venomously at the young man. He turned to me, his hands raised in surrender, sweat glistening on his forehead. Your Honor, please. We understand completely. The lesson has been learned. There is no need to involve the district attorney's office. We will pay the judgment in full. Right here, right now. He reached furiously inside his tailored jacket, pulling out a sleek leather checkbook, not Julian's. It was likely a discretionary fund, meant exactly for fixing the senator's messy family problems. Put that away, I commanded coldly, pointing my pen at the handler. I don't want your money, sir. He is the defendant. He drove the car. He broke the fence. He destroyed the garden. He writes the check. And it comes out of his account. The handler grabbed Julian by the arm, his fingers digging viciously into the expensive fabric of the suit. Write the damn check, Julian, he muttered through gritted teeth, his political survival instincts overriding any loyalty to the spoiled kid. Empty your trust. Do it now before she locks you in a cell. With violently shaking hands, Julian pulled his own checkbook from his breast pocket. He couldn't even hold the gold-plated pen straight. It took him 3 tries to write out the amount. $8,500 for the damages, plus the $250 in court filing fees. He ripped it from the ledger, his head bowed, utterly defeated and thoroughly humiliated in front of the cameras, the gallery, and the elderly woman he had treated like absolute garbage just weeks prior. My bailiff stepped forward, took the check from Julian's trembling fingers, inspected it for accuracy, and handed it gently to Mrs. Vance. She looked down at the slip of paper, her frail hands shaking slightly, but this time, not from fear or intimidation. It was the quiet, powerful relief of a woman who had just watched a giant fall. They walked out of my courtroom in absolute silence. Julian Sterling, the boy who had strutted in like he owned the building, shuffled out looking like a deflated balloon. His slick handler practically shoved him through the double doors, desperate to escape the cameras and the public humiliation. Mrs. Vance stayed behind for just a moment. She looked at the check in her trembling hands, then looked up at the bench. She didn't say a word, just gave a small, profound nod. I nodded back. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just the quiet restoration of what was wrongfully taken. That should have been the end of it. Another entitled brat paying his dues, another mess cleaned up. But the universe has a funny way of making sure hard lessons stick. Despite the handler's desperate attempts to keep the settlement quiet, you can't gag a courtroom full of spectators. By that evening, the story had leaked to the local press. The headline didn't just highlight the midnight crash. It highlighted the perjury, the vodka bottle, and the breathtaking arrogance. The political fallout was spectacular. Senator Sterling tried to spin it, tried to distance himself from his own son, but the voters weren't buying the excuses. 2 months later, he lost his primary election by a humiliating landslide. The Sterling family name, once an impenetrable shield of power, had collapsed under the weight of its own entitlement. I didn't think much about Julian Sterling after that. I had new cases, new liars, and new excuses to dismantle. But 18 months later, my clerk walked into my chambers and handed me a handwritten letter. The return address wasn't a luxury condo. It was a local community center. Your Honor, the letter began, you probably don't care to hear from me, but I needed to write this. When you threatened to send my case to the DA, my father finally cut me off to save his own skin. No trust fund, no cars, no fixers. I spent 30 days in county jail for the DUI and the last year working construction just to pay my own rent. I hated you for a long time, but last week I helped build a new community garden for a neighborhood outreach program. I looked at the soil we were planting in, and all I could think about was Mrs. Vance's roses. I finally understood what I destroyed that night. Not just a wooden fence, but a piece of her heart. You were the first person in my entire life who didn't care who my father was. You only cared about what I did. Thank you for stripping away my delusions before they killed someone. I read the letter twice. Then, I folded it neatly and slipped it into the top drawer of my desk. I don't do gold stars, and I certainly don't hand out cookies for people finally acting like decent human beings. But as I sat there in the quiet of my chambers, I did let out a short, dry laugh. People always ask me why I'm so tough, why I don't show more sympathy on the bench. This is exactly why. Sympathy doesn't raise adults. Truth does. A spoiled politician's son walked into my courtroom expecting to buy his way out of a consequence. He walked out with a brutal reality check that shattered his entire worldview, and surprisingly, he used the broken pieces to build something better. I adjusted my robe, picked up my gavel, and looked at the next file on my docket. Another case, another excuse. I took a deep breath and stepped back out into the courtroom. Because in a world obsessed with power, wealth, and privilege, someone has to be the brick wall, and I'm not going anywhere.